These conflicts, which pit farmers and rural communities who fear for their livestock against conservationists and urban populations who value the wolf's return for ecological and symbolic reasons, replay in a modern key the ancient tension that the Norse expressed through their mythology of the sacred wolf, the tension between the wolf as threat and the wolf as sacred presence, between the wolf as destroyer of the human world and the wolf as necessary participant in the larger natural order that sustains the human world. The intensity of these modern conflicts suggests that the wolf continues to function even in thoroughly secularized modern societies as something more than a merely biological entity, as a symbol and a lightning rod for deeper anxieties about the relationship between human civilization and the natural world, anxieties that are remarkably continuous with the spiritual concerns that drove the Norse elaboration of wolf symbolism in the first place. The raven, similarly, has become a focus of intense scientific and cultural interest in the modern world, with recent discoveries about raven cognition and social behavior generating widespread popular fascination that goes well beyond the scientific community and that draws on the same deep well of cultural association between ravens and intelligence, mystery, and spiritual significance that the Norse tapped when they made the raven the messenger of Odin. The work of researchers such as Bernd Heinrich, whose book Mind of the Raven transformed popular understanding of raven intelligence and behavior, and Thomas Bugner, whose studies of raven social cognition have revealed capabilities that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between brain size and cognitive complexity, has given the raven a new kind of sacred status in modern culture. Not the sacred status of a divine messenger, but the sacred status of a being that complicates and enriches our understanding of what consciousness is and what it can be. A being whose intelligence is different from ours, but not inferior to ours, whose social life is complex and emotionally rich, and whose presence in the world is a reminder that human consciousness is not the only form of sophisticated awareness that evolution has produced on this planet. This modern scientific engagement with the raven's intelligence connects in a deep and perhaps unexpected way to the Norse understanding of Hugin and Munin as manifestations of thought and memory, the two fundamental faculties of conscious intelligence. When modern researchers discover that ravens can plan for the future, that they can remember specific past events and use those memories to make predictions about what will happen next, that they can attribute mental states to other individuals and adjust their behavior accordingly, they are discovering in scientific language the same qualities that the Norse expressed mythologically through their description of Odin's ravens as the embodiments of thought and memory, the creatures in whom the most essential faculties of conscious intelligence were externalized and made visible. The convergence between the Norse mythological intuition about ravens and the modern scientific understanding of raven cognition is not a coincidence, but a reflection of the fact that the Norse, through their centuries of intimate observation of raven behavior in the northern landscape, had developed a remarkably accurate, if mythologically expressed, understanding of what made ravens extraordinary, an understanding that the tools of modern science are now able to articulate with greater precision, but that the Norse, in their own way, had already grasped. As we reach the conclusion of this long journey through the history and the meaning of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens, it is worth pausing to reflect on what this relationship tells us, not just about the Norse specifically, but about the human condition more broadly, about the universal human need for a living relationship with the non-human world, for sacred animals that embody the qualities and the forces that exceed our individual capacities, and that connect us to the larger patterns of existence that give our brief lives their meaning and their context. Every human culture that has left any record of its spiritual beliefs has developed sacred relationships with particular animals, relationships that are always rooted in direct observation of real animal behavior, but that are simultaneously expressions of the deepest human concerns about existence, about power, about mortality, about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the body, about the forces that sustain life and the forces that destroy it. The Norse relationship with wolves and ravens is one of the most fully developed and most richly documented of these sacred animal relationships. A tradition that encompasses mythology and art and law and shamanic practice and ecological observation and personal devotion in a synthesis of extraordinary comprehensiveness and depth. And it speaks to us across the millennium and more, that separates us from the Viking age with a power and a relevance that does not diminish with distance, but seems, if anything, to increase as our own civilization's relationship with the natural world becomes more attenuated, more mediated, more abstract, and more desperate. The wolf and the raven are still out there, still running through the northern forests and still wheeling above the mountain ridges, still howling on winter nights and still calling from the bare branches of winter trees, still being what they have always been, which is themselves, fully and completely and magnificently themselves, neither the divine messengers of Odin's court, nor the diabolical agents of Christian darkness, neither the romantic symbols of nationalist mythology, nor the charismatic megafauna of conservation biology, but real, living, breathing, thinking, feeling creatures who share this planet with us, and who have been sharing it with us and our ancestors for as long as our species has existed. The Norse understood that to live well in the world, to live as a complete and conscious human being rather than as a frightened animal huddled against the darkness, it was necessary to maintain a relationship with creatures like the wolf and the raven, to attend to them, to honor them, to allow them to teach us what they have to teach about the nature of the world we inhabit and our place within it. This understanding, expressed in the old Norse tradition through the beautiful and terrifying mythology of Hugin and Munin, of Geri and Freki, of Fenrir and Skull and Hati, of the Ulfhedna and the Velvur and the Raven banners of Viking warlords, is perhaps the most enduring and the most important legacy of the Viking relationship with their sacred animals, a legacy that asks us, across the centuries, whether we are still paying attention, whether we still know how to read the flight of a raven or the howl of a wolf as something more than a biological fact, whether we still possess the wisdom and the courage to look into the yellow eyes of the wolf and the black eyes of the raven, and to see there, as the Norse saw, the reflection of forces that made us and that will outlast us, forces that are neither good nor evil, but simply, terrifyingly, magnificently real. The deepest and most enduring legacy of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens lies not in any single artifact or text or ritual practice, but in the way that this relationship shaped the fundamental structures of Norse thought, the categories and the assumptions and the emotional orientations through which the Norse people made sense of their experience and communicated that sense to one another and to the generations that followed them. To understand this legacy fully, we must return to the most basic level of the Norse worldview and ask what it was about the way that the Norse understood reality that made the wolf and the raven not merely important animals, but necessary animals, creatures without whom the Norse cosmos would have been not just impoverished, but fundamentally incomplete, creatures whose presence was not supplementary to the human world, but constitutive of it, woven into its very fabric in ways that could not be removed without unraveling the whole. This question brings us back, finally, to the philosophical heart of Norse spirituality, to the understanding of the sacred that distinguishes the Norse tradition from the traditions that eventually replaced it, and that gave the wolf and the raven their particular and irreplaceable significance in the Norse spiritual imagination, the Norse understanding of the sacred, as we have seen throughout this narrative, was fundamentally different from the understanding of the sacred that characterized the monotheistic Christianity that eventually displaced it. And this difference was not merely a matter of the number of gods or the specific content of the theological beliefs, but reflected a deeper divergence in the basic metaphysical assumptions about the nature of reality and the place of the Frus, divine, within it. In the Christian framework, the sacred was understood as something fundamentally separate from the ordinary material world, as a quality that belonged essentially and exclusively to God, and that was present in the created world only insofar as God chose to make it present through special acts of grace or revelation. The material world, including the animal world, was in itself not sacred, but was merely a created object, valuable as a demonstration of God's power and wisdom, but not itself divine, not itself possessed of the kind of intrinsic spiritual significance that could make it an object of religious attention in its own right. This framework made it possible, in principle, to draw a clear line between the sacred and the profane, between the realm of religious experience and the realm of ordinary material existence, and to confine religious practice to specific times, places, and activities that were formally designated as sacred, while treating the rest of life as a domain of practical activity that was religiously neutral. The Norse framework, by contrast, did not permit this kind of separation between the sacred and the ordinary, because in the Norse understanding of reality, there was no domain of existence that was fundamentally profane, no aspect of the world that was intrinsically empty of spiritual significance. The Norse cosmos was, from its highest reaches to its lowest depths, saturated with spiritual power, with the intentions and the energies of beings whose existence intersected constantly and unpredictably with the lives of ordinary mortals, and the animal world was one of the most important sites of this intersection, one of the most reliable places where the spiritual dimensions of reality were most clearly visible and most immediately accessible. This is why the wolf and the raven were not merely symbols of spiritual ideas, but were themselves spiritual presences. Why? The Norse did not simply use wolves and ravens as convenient metaphors for the qualities they admired and feared, but genuinely believed that these animals participated in the sacred in a direct and literal way, that they were, in their own nature and not merely by human attribution, connected to the divine forces that govern the cosmos and shape the fates of gods and mortals alike. This understanding of the animal world as a domain of genuine spiritual presence and activity, rather than as a merely material backdrop against which the more important drama of human and divine interaction was played out, has consequences that extend far beyond the specific question of wolf and raven symbolism, and touch on some of the most fundamental questions about the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world that any spiritual tradition can raise. The Norse tradition, in its insistence that the sacred was not confined to the human sphere, but was distributed throughout the living world, in its willingness to honor the intelligence and the power and the spiritual significance of non-human creatures, in its refusal to draw a sharp ontological boundary between the human and the animal, was expressing a vision of the relationship between consciousness and life that is, in many respects, more ecologically and philosophically sophisticated than the framework that replaced it, a framework that placed human beings at the center of creation and assigned to the non-human world a purely instrumental value that has had catastrophic consequences for the health of the planet and for the spiritual health of the planet, human beings who inhabit it. The Norse did not idealize nature in the way that some later traditions have done, projecting onto the natural world a benevolence and a harmony that it does not in fact possess. The Norse knew better than most that nature was violent and indifferent and capable of destroying human life and human civilization with complete disregard for human wishes or human merit. They had lived in the northern landscape long enough to understand at the deepest level what it meant to be subject to forces that did not care about human survival, and that could not be appeased or negotiated with in any ultimate sense. The wolf that killed your sheep in the night was not evil in any moral sense. It was simply hungry. The storm that sank your ship and drowned your crew was not malicious. It was simply the weather. The plague that swept through your community and killed half the population was not a punishment from the gods. It was simply disease. The Norse had no illusions about the fundamental indifference of the natural world to human concerns, and their mythology reflected this understanding with a brutal honesty that was, in its own way, deeply comforting, because it meant that the tragedies of human life were not signs of divine displeasure or personal, moral failure, but were simply the inevitable consequences of being finite creatures in an infinite and indifferent universe. What the consequences? Norse did, through their relationship with sacred animals like the wolf and the raven, was not to idealize the natural world, but to take it seriously, to engage with it fully, to refuse the temptation of anthropocentrism that would place human concerns at the center of the universe and reduce everything else to mere backdrop. In taking the wolf and the raven seriously, in honoring their intelligence and their power and their spiritual significance, in allowing them to serve as windows onto dimensions of reality that exceeded the merely human, the Norse were practicing a form of what we might call ecological humility, a recognition of the limits of human power and human understanding, and a willingness to look beyond the human sphere for guidance and for truth. This ecological humility was not weakness but wisdom, the wisdom of people who had learned through long experience that the world was larger and more complex and more powerful than any human civilization, and that the only sensible response to this reality was not to deny it or to try to overcome it, but to understand it as fully as possible and to find within it the resources for living with courage and with grace in the face of the inevitable. The wolf and the raven were the primary instruments through which the Norse practiced this ecological humility, the living teachers through whom they learned the lessons that the natural world had to offer to those who were willing to pay attention. The wolf taught the Norse about the social foundations of survival, about the way in which individual strength was always dependent on collective support, about the way in which hierarchy and loyalty and the willingness to fight for the group were not merely social conveniences, but were fundamental to the possibility of life itself. The raven taught the Norse about the power of intelligence and observation, about the way in which knowledge, genuine knowledge of the world as it actually is, rather than as we wish it to be, was the most powerful survival tool available to any creature, human or animal. Together, the wolf and the raven taught the Norse about the relationship between strength and wisdom, between action and understanding, between the physical and the intellectual dimensions of existence, and the synthesis of these teachings, embodied in the figure of Odin, who kept both wolves and ravens as his sacred companions, constituted the Norse ideal of the complete being, the being who united in themselves the ferocity and the endurance of the wolf with the perception and the intelligence of the raven, and who was therefore equipped as fully as any mortal creature could be to face the challenges and the terrors of existence with something approaching adequacy. The figure of Odin as the keeper of wolves and ravens is, in this reading, not merely a mythological curiosity or a piece of theological symbolism, but a philosophical statement about the nature of human excellence, about what it means to be fully and completely a human being, in a world that is always larger and more powerful than any individual human life. The All-Father, who sat on his high seat with ravens on his shoulders and wolves at his feet, was not a comfortable or a reassuring figure, not a God of mercy or of unconditional love, not a protector who would shield his followers from the consequences of their actions or the cruelties of fate. He was a God of awareness, of relentless and unflinching engagement with reality as it actually was, a God who had sacrificed his eye for wisdom, and who wore the wound of that sacrifice as a permanent reminder that genuine knowledge always comes at a cost, that understanding the world more fully means giving up the comfortable illusions that make ordinary life bearable. His wolves and his ravens were the external expressions of this commitment to awareness, the animal companions through whose eyes and through whose instincts the God who had already seen more than any other being continued to see, continued to learn, continued to prepare himself for the end that he knew was coming and that he could not prevent, but that he refused to meet in ignorance. This image of the divine philosopher warrior, surrounded by his sacred animals and sustained by his commitment to awareness rather than by any hope of ultimate victory, has a quality of tragic grandeur that speaks to something universal in the human experience of consciousness and mortality. Every conscious being that has ever lived has faced the fundamental situation that Odin embodies in the Norse mythology, the situation of being aware of one's own mortality and of the impermanence of everything one loves and values, of knowing that the end will come and that it cannot be prevented, and of having to find a way to live fully and meaningfully in the face of this knowledge. The Norse solution to this universal human problem was not resignation or denial or the search for an afterlife in which the losses of this world would be made good, but was instead a fierce, clear-eyed engagement with the world as it is, an engagement sustained by the qualities that the wolf and the raven embodied, by the wolf's strength and endurance and refusal to surrender, and by the raven's intelligence and perception and refusal to remain ignorant. The Vikings kept wolves and ravens as sacred companions because these animals represented, in their most essential natures, the qualities that a human being needed to face the truth of existence without flinching, and to live within that truth with dignity and with courage. The runes that Odin discovered through his self-sacrifice on Yggdrasil, the system of writing and magical signs that the Norse believed had been given to humanity by the All-Father at the cost of 9 days of agony, are sometimes interpreted as the key to understanding the deepest level of the Norse spiritual tradition, and there is a sense in which the runes and the sacred animals of the Norse tradition are complementary expressions of the same fundamental insight. The runes were not merely an alphabet, a system for recording spoken language in visual form, but were understood by the Norse as a set of fundamental principles, cosmic forces that underlay the structure of reality, and that could be accessed and employed by those who had sufficient wisdom and courage to do so. Each runic symbol represented not just a sound, but a concept, a force, a pattern of existence, and the use of runes in magical practice was understood as a form of alignment with these fundamental forces, a way of bringing one's intentions and one's actions into harmony with the deep structure of the cosmos. In this sense, the runes and the sacred animals of the Norse tradition were performing similar spiritual functions, both serving as interfaces between the human world and the deeper patterns of reality, both providing the Norse with tools for accessing and working with forces that exceeded the ordinary human capacity for action and understanding. The rune that is most closely associated with wolves in the Norse runic tradition is the rune known as Tiwaz or Tyr, which carries connotations of justice, sacrifice, and the willingness to accept personal loss for the sake of the greater good, associations that are directly connected to the story of Tyr's sacrifice of his hand in the binding of Fenrir that we discussed earlier in this narrative. The rune most closely associated with ravens is often identified as Othala or Ansus, depending on the specific interpretive tradition one follows, with Ansus being particularly connected to Odin and to the divine communication and wisdom that Odin's ravens embodied. The existence of specific runic associations for the sacred animals of the Norse tradition is further evidence of the depth and the comprehensiveness of the integration of wolves and ravens into the Norse spiritual framework, an integration that extended from the grandest mythological narratives to the smallest individual acts of magical practice, from the great stories of Fenrir's binding and Ragnarok to the individual rune carver who inscribed a wolf or a raven sign on a piece of wood or bone in the hope of accessing some small portion of the power that these animals embodied. The relationship between the sacred animals of the Norse tradition and the practice of rune magic opens onto the broader question of how ordinary Norse people, as opposed to the gods and heroes and shamans who dominate the literary sources, engaged with the spiritual significance of wolves and ravens in their daily lives, a question that is difficult to answer with certainty given the nature of the available evidence, but that is of crucial importance for understanding the full scope and the genuine human depth of the tradition we have been exploring. The great myths and the elaborate shamanic practices and the sophisticated poetic tradition were all, in their different ways, expressions of the same underlying spiritual orientation that the entire Norse culture shared, but they were also, to some degree, products of a social elite, of the kings and chieftains and skalds and Völva who had the leisure and the resources to develop these traditions to their highest level of sophistication. The farmer in his longhouse in the Norwegian fjords, the fisherman on the Icelandic coast, the thrall working the fields of a Danish estate, these people also lived within the Norse spiritual framework and also participated in the sacred relationship with wolves and ravens that this framework established, but their participation was necessarily less elaborate and less formally articulated than that of the elite whose practices and beliefs the literary sources most fully document. For the ordinary Norse person, the relationship with wolves and ravens was lived primarily at the level of the immediate and the practical. In the daily experience of sharing a landscape with these animals, in the folk beliefs, and the observational practices that had grown up around centuries of coexistence, in the names they bore, and the objects they wore, and the stories they told their children on winter nights by the fire.